Well, hello and welcome back, everybody, to Science and Orthodoxy. And on today's topic, we'll be talking about the theory of evolution. This one can get a little bit noun heavy and a little bit word heavy. So if you have any questions, for those of you who are watching live, just feel free to stop me and I'll try to clarify terms that you don't understand. And just like the previous lectures, my views and opinions and my statements about them that I made in the first lecture series still hold true to this one. So let us continue on. And I would be greatly remiss if I didn't start this topic off with without talking about Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. And he was a British naturalist and materialist. A naturalist is a person who studies and observes the natural world and flora and fauna within it. His first foray into his professional career was on the HMS Beagle during its expedition from 1831 to 1836. And on this expedition, he was the ship's naturalist, where he would observe and record data and information about the local flora and fauna on this trip. And specifically, this trip was to the Galapagos Islands. And on this trip, he made several observations that would later become key observations as a part of the theory of evolution. It wasn't until the 1840s when he started developing and working on this theory based off his observations that occurred between 1831 to 1836. And it was in 1859 that he released his book entitled On the Origin of Species, which he released his theory, the theory of evolution, to the greater scientific audience. And so this theory predominantly states that life derives itself from pre-existent life, that every single species and all the biodiversity that we see on planet Earth is all coming from a single originator species that developed into all kinds of other different species that we see on Earth today. And it's primarily due to genetic variation that exists in these individual species, and natural selection for these different traits that are the key mechanisms for the speciation that occurs, according to the theory. And so many of you have probably heard the statement of survival of the fittest. And that's a key tenet of the theory of evolution, that an organism that has traits that allow it to survive and better adapt to its specific environment will be able to pass those on to its offspring. And its offspring will then be able to carry those on. And those that don't have that trait or don't have the ability to adapt to their environment as well will then die off, so that only the strongest survive, or those that at least have the best traits for the specific ecological niche that they live in will. And so what exactly is evolution? Now, I've talked about the man who created it and a little bit about it, but what exactly is it? What are some definitions to help us get a good idea? And so it's, according to dictionary.com, any process of formation or growth or development. And specific to the theory of evolution as it pertains to biology, it can be defined as the phenomena that populations of organisms change from one generation to the next. As a result, some become more successful at survival and reproduction. And within this, there are two primary categories of the theory of evolution. And this is microevolution and macroevolution, one of which is very well accepted by all Christians and all people of faith, and one is incredibly controversial. And I'll start with microevolution first. And so what exactly is microevolution? Microevolution can be defined as the changes that occur at or below the species level in a population's gene pool. This is talking about all the genetic variability that exists within humans, within dogs, within cats, or any other animal that exists on planet Earth. And it's completely within a species itself. We're not talking about one species becoming another or one species breaking off into two different species. That's not involved with microevolution exactly. It's primarily just dealing at the species level of what happens there. And this can be observed directly by scientists. We see this every day, and we can interact with it. And this microevolution that exists is not controversial at all to Christians, non-Christians, to anybody. We as Orthodox Christians accept, believe, and know this to be true. This may come as a shock to you, but we do believe the theory of evolution to be true, because we also believe that microevolution is true because we ourselves can interact and see it ourselves. And microevolution has many different impacts on the scientific landscape, one of which could be within the field of population genetics, where you can track and measure with statistics the changes in the genetic makeup of different organisms and different traits that exist. This is also especially useful in the field of forensic science. And you can also use this to look at different genetic diseases and other different things. Likewise, there is a concept known as horizontal gene transfer, where microevolution occurs in real time. This occurs with bacteria with antibiotic resistance, where one bacteria that is resistant to a specific antibiotic, let's say amoxicillin in this case, and it has this trait, it can actually pass that off to another bacteria and basically propagate this antibiotic resistance in other different bacteria by transferring this specific gene between different bacteria, thus showing microevolution in real time. Likewise, another good example that humans themselves have done, mind you, is artificial selection, where we specifically select traits that exist in a specific animal or a population, and we cause selective breeding to occur so that the offspring have the traits that we want or desire. This occurs in farming, but specifically in dog breeding. Humans have made the breeds of dogs that exist today. We have selectively bred them so that they exhibit the specific traits, whether they be Chihuahuas, Pomeranians, what have you. We chose them because we selected the traits and caused the dogs to be bred to exhibit these traits. That's what happens with purebred dogs. And it can also occur in farming, where a farmer would want to breed fruit trees so that he has the largest, most plump, most ripe fruits that would be the tastiest. This is also true there too. And we as humans do this each and every day. And this part of evolution is not controversial at all. It's observed directly, and it's firmly cemented within the scientific landscape of today. Now let's go on to macroevolution. Now this is the one that can be very controversial to many people. And it's not as easily observed directly. And this can be defined as evolutionary changes that produce new species and groups of species. So this is where I was talking to you about speciation, where one species develops into a new species. This is what this is talking about. This is macroevolution, as opposed to microevolution. And this occurs primarily through the avenue of natural selection of microevolutionary changes, so that microevolutionary changes build up within a specific organism or a specific species of organisms, and they eventually lead to the differentiation of different species. How does this occur? Well, there's a lot of different ideas and hypotheses about this, because there's not really one set concept for what defines a species. I'm going to give you a couple different definitions for some different ones that do exist within science. One concept for a species is that the species can interbreed and produce viable offspring. What do I mean by viable offspring? A viable offspring is one that can produce its own offspring afterwards. While a tiger and a lion can produce a liger in captivity, that liger is typically sterile and cannot produce its own. So a tiger and lion would be, by this definition, separate species, even though they can't technically reproduce. The offspring that they have is not viable. The same thing is true for a horse and a donkey, which produce a mule. An additional definition for what a species is, to show you the differences that exist, is that a species could be defined by its evolutionary lineages, that a specific species could be tracked based off how its evolutionary line has changed throughout time. And that would be denoted different than, say, another species. That you could show a difference of species between humans and dogs because our evolutionary lines would be different. A third definition that exists for a species is that a species can be defined as something that occupies a specific ecological niche, such that a species can exist in an environment in a specific way, and that species occupies this environmental area to live and survive in the environment, and that's the niche that it lives in, and it can be defined based off of that. And so there's not really one set concept of species, so it makes sometimes speciation and defining it a little difficult, because there's multiple definitions floating around for what even a species is. And so one specific method in which speciation occurs is called allopatric speciation. This occurs where, say, a population of birds exists on a mainland, and then say this population breaks off and goes to an island somewhere and they can't get back to the mainland. The population on the island would then develop separately from the one on the mainland, and this physical separation would result in the development of each population into a different species because they have different ecological needs in each environment. And the one on the island would need to have a different set of needs than the other one in the mainland, which would result in them developing into different species. So allopatric speciation primarily deals with physical separation of similar organisms. The opposite is somewhat true with sympatric speciation, where there's not really physical separation that occurs. And this occurs much more frequently in plants, or at least is believed to be more so in plants than animals. An example of this possibly happening in animals could be in my previous example, where a tiger and a lion were able to produce a liger, but that offspring is not viable. In the case that it was viable, that would be an example of sympatric speciation. This also can occur in some plants as well. And so there's also multiple hypotheses about the rate of speciation. Now I've said that term a couple times today. Let's review for my first lecture about what the term hypothesis means. It's effectively an educated guess backed by some evidence. It doesn't always make correct predictions. That's what a theory does. So there's two major ideas for how fast this speciation occurs. It takes place over a long period of time, but how fast does it happen within a specific species? And one of which is called gradualism, where repeated small microevolutionary changes just build up and build up and build up. And over time, this results in a slow, gradual change from one species to another. Now, this is contrasted by punctuated equilibrium. This is where there's a bunch of neutral mutations that occur, neutral microevolutionary changes, and then rapidly all at once, a species develops from one species to another. And so these are the two ideas. They have its proponents and its detractors that exist. And so they are both being debated currently and about microevolution. And so like I said before, with any theory, there has to be evidence backing it up. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the evidence that does exist that supports the theory of evolution. And so the first and foremost, I need to talk about fossil records. Now, I do want to state a little caveat here in that our fossil records that we do have are not complete. This is because our fossil records are somewhat biased. This is because certain things fossilize better. Bones fossilize better than other material. The same thing is true for different shells, that they fossilize better. So our fossil records are not complete. It does not show the record of every single species that ever existed on planet Earth all the way through its history. But we do have some, especially in horses. We have a lot of skeletal structures and fossils of horses, which show these transitional forms. Transitional forms are basically, for lack of better terms, a missing link, or a link between different species about how they transitioned and altered throughout time. We have a lot of fossil records for horses that show this occurring. Likewise, there's something known as convergent evolution, where two different species that are not linked and are very separate from each other evolve the same characteristics to fit within a specific ecological niche. What I mean by this is, you can see this with birds and bats, where both have evolved the ability of flight and similar mechanisms to do this, but they're not evolutionarily linked or very similar. And there's a great deal of difference between the two. The same can be true for anteaters and echidnas, where they both have a long snout and a long tongue that's useful for eating ants, and both have evolved the same characteristic to survive in a similar ecological niche. And also, like I said before, selective breeding, where we have purebred dogs that humans have done. We have caused evolutionary changes to occur in animals because we wanted to, and we did it. And lastly, but certainly not least, homologies occur. This can be both anatomical and molecular. For my figure on the right-hand side, you'll see some anatomical homologies, where there's this similar 5-bone structure that occurs in many animals. Humans are in the center with birds and bats below, and then horses, dolphins, and turtles above it, where they have the same similar 5 different type of bones in the same approximate order and very similar structure. And scientists believe that this lends itself to the idea that there was a common ancestor to all of these at some point in the evolutionary history of life on Earth. And likewise, molecular homology, as you can see with this chart here, where you don't actually really need to know the specific gene and like the specific protein, cytochrome C. It's not really important. What this is really showing is that for the specific gene that codes for cytochrome C, there are similarities and some differences that occur between different organisms whenever you look at the genetic code. And going from humans on the left all the way to Neospora on the right. And the closer you are to humans, obviously you would expect the code itself to be more similar and have less differences. And that's exactly what you see whenever scientists look at the genetic code. And so this is another example and evidence pointing to the theory of evolution that exists. And so together with the theory of evolution, we need to talk a little bit about the origins of life on Earth. And so there's a lot of things we do not know about this in science. And so, like I said before in the last lecture, the age of the Earth was determined by radioactive dating using uranium-235. And so this has dated the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old. And so there's no one set hypothesis as to the conditions on primordial Earth. We don't exactly know the chemical and physical composition of Earth at the beginning. And what was going on in this primordial soup that existed, that life arose out of. There are a couple ideas based on fossil records and geologic data that people have believed it to be, but there's not really one set idea. And so I'm not really going to try and talk too in depth about these different ideas. And likewise, there are many hypotheses about the formation of the building blocks of life. These are amino acids that make proteins, nucleotides, which comprise our DNA and RNA. The same thing is true for sugars, which make carbohydrates. Same thing for lipids, which make fats. There's many ideas about how these things arose out of primordial Earth. And a really interesting experiment that existed and that happened was a scientist took the proposed composition of primordial Earth, put it into basically a sealed test tube within a sealed environment approximate to what he believed the chemical environment was, and then struck it with lightning. And after testing the components of this mixture, he found that spontaneously after these lightning strikes, some of the basic building blocks of life were formed. Some amino acids were spontaneously formed from this experiment, thus lending some evidence to not only the hypothesis for the composition of early Earth, but also that life could form spontaneously, according to science. And so the basic gist of how life arose on Earth is that you start with organic compounds, this inanimate matter, that then get composed into organic compounds and some of the building blocks of life, like I talked to you about. And these building blocks of life then get strung together in what's known as a polymer. This is effectively just a long chain that gets folded and shaped into a usable form that can then do work or then catalyze reactions or do various other things structurally and functionally in cells. And then these got organized together into cells, thus producing life, according to science. And so after talking about all of this, there are many questions that arise as Orthodox Christians about this theory. And if you look at the theory from only a materialistic perspective, it can leave one feeling somewhat sad because it just shows life as coming from this cosmic roll of dice, that life was just a random chance that, if done again, may not even happen or would happen completely differently. And that life itself effectively is meaningless because it just comes about through this deterministic and fatalistic method, that this survival of the fittest is just so cutthroat and just doesn't really care about people, or then that shows a world without purpose. And we as Orthodox Christians cannot accept that perspective. We ourselves are not materialists, or we're not supposed to be, at least. And so it shows life as without meaning and unimportant, which we as Orthodox Christians categorically disagree with. Life has meaning, life has purpose in Christ, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. And so something also to be said is that evolution is here to stay in science. By and large, it's not going anywhere. It's firmly rooted within the scientific landscape and scientific thought, and there's a great deal of evidence pointing to it. So it's not really going anywhere. We as Orthodox Christians can't just stick our heads in the sand or put our fingers in our ears and say, la, 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 I'm not listening. We need to address it and look at it and engage with it from an Orthodox perspective. And that's what I hope we'll be able to do. And so some questions that I have thought of that I think of whenever I look at the theory of evolution is, what is humanity? Because if mankind, I forgot to mention this earlier, but there is a misnomer that occurs when people talk about the theory of evolution, and especially macroevolution. People believe that humans and modern primates, or people say that humans evolved from monkeys. This isn't technically a true statement. A more correct statement would be that humans and modern primates evolved from a common ancestor, that we had a common ancestor that at some point in our evolutionary history diverged into modern humans and modern primates. And so, sorry for that slight digression. I forgot to mention that earlier. And so what exactly is a human, especially if mankind developed in this evolutionary manner? Likewise, what does the theory of evolution mean in connection with Christ's human nature? Because Christ took upon our human nature, and he elevated human nature by his divinity and the incarnation itself. So how does this affect this? Furthermore, what is the difference between man and beast if man is evolutionarily linked to beasts and the beasts of the earth? Should one address this? Likewise, how can we as Orthodox Christians reconcile the scientific data, because this theory is here to stay, at least for the time being that I'm aware of, with the patristic tradition of the Orthodox Church? And that's the question I'm going to start off with before going to the others, because I feel like it's the most important to start with before going on to the other theological questions, because we really need to reconcile the data first before we can really start answering and getting into other questions. And so how can we actually reconcile the theory of evolution and orthodoxy? Because we ourselves said we know that life has a purpose. And so something to be said when reading and looking at the saints' writings on creation, there's a lot of theologomena that exists, and the saints explain creation using the science and culture of their day. And so they use this to explain the theological truths that they're trying to talk about. And a good example of this could be St. Gregory of Nyssa, the brother of St. Basil the Great, in his writing An Apology for the Hexameron. The Hexameron, if you remember, is literally means the 6 days, and it was a writing done by St. Basil the Great. And so in this, he presents a geocentric world where the earth is the center of the universe, and there are with heaven and the heavenly bodies circling around it. And so he uses this imagery to sort of explain theological truths. Well, we as modern people know that the earth is heliocentric, that the earth revolves around the sun. The theological truth that he said, despite the science of his day being technically wrong, still hold true and have a great deal of value in our lives this day. And so, furthermore, like I said last time, ancient science has not been dogmatized, nor necessarily should it, nor should modern science be dogmatized either. And so it hasn't been. It can be used to teach theology and teach theological truths. And so St. Gregory of Nyssa, in his writing on the making of man, specifically in section 8.5, does give a little bit of an inclination of a sort of evolutionary idea. I don't mean to say that St. Gregory of Nyssa had an idea of evolution, because as we've already discussed, evolution didn't really come into the main scientific mindset until 1859, when Charles Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species. And I hope nobody thinks that I'm trying to state that St. Gregory of Nyssa would have believed or agreed with evolution necessarily. But he does have some writings that do lend themselves as modern readers to remind one of the theory of evolution. And in this work, he talks about the systematic organization of the earth and of mankind, that it starts with that God has organized the earth and the world, starting from inorganic and inanimate matter, leading all the way to mankind. and especially looking at the days of creation, which I'm not going to really go into too much depth. If you want to learn a little bit more about what I was talking about with that, I would watch lecture 2 on the Big Bang Theory, where I go much more in depth into the days of creation, where St. Basil is talking about starting from where God has ordered creation, starting with the earth, then going to the plants and then the animals, and filling the world with living creatures, finally culminating in mankind. And so a quote from this section that I found especially helpful is that man was made last after the animals as nature advanced in an orderly course to perfection. And so man is blended of every form of soul. Basically, he gets the idea that man is the form of, is basically the culmination of all the life and all the creation preceding him, which definitely does give it a very much evolutionary slant. Likewise, the Cappadocian Fathers, which is St. Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, represent nature as this dynamic and interactive event within which both divine and cosmic energies are converging and synergizing, so that the natural order, the natural law that God himself has instituted, coalesces and works synergistically with God in shaping creation and shaping matter to be what God has designed for it. And so likewise, continuing on with St. Gregory. St. Gregory saw the universe as being created in one event. This can be seen in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and then being ordered in time throughout a series of subsequent events. And this takes place over the 6 days of creation. Likewise, St. Irenaeus of Lyons taught that the Father created and fashioned, the Logos established, and the Holy Spirit ordered creation. St. Irenaeus does not use the same verbiage for creation for each person of the Trinity. He says the Father created, the Logos established, and the Holy Spirit ordered. This difference of terminology, this difference of verbiage, denotes a succession and a difference that occurs, that the entire Trinity is involved with creation, but yet there's a difference between each one's actions as a part of it, and noting a bit of succession. Likewise, St. Basil the Great talked about how the emergence of life is constantly occurring, that it's still occurring even to this present day. And there's this concept of continuous creation, that God has not abandoned his creation, that God is still continuing to create, continuing to order the world, and continuing to work even into this present day. He used a specific scientific example of this from his day and age, where he said that various frogs and eels were birthed forth from the ground as if spontaneously through a supernatural act. Now, we are, as modern people, will look back on that and say that's a little ridiculous, because we know and can observe and see that frogs and eels have a mating cycle. They have specific reproductive cycles, and that they weren't just spontaneously coming out of the ground. But to St. Basil, you have to look at the ancient perspective, where they did see this, and they did think that they were just spontaneously coming out of the ground. And you have to look at the theological truth that he's trying to get at, while the science, as when compared to modern day, would factually be wrong. He's stating that creation is continually occurring and that God's still doing it. And he used a specific example from his day and age to explain that concept. So likewise, continuing on, St. Dionysius the Areopagite, or rather pseudo-St. Dionysius the Areopagite, because the writings of St. Dionysius the Areopagite appear much later after the lifetime of Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the disciple of St. Paul. They occur much later. I think they appear right around the 4th or 5th century, somewhere right around there, because St. Maximus the Confessor talks about him, and he was from right around that time. But I digress. So that's why I say pseudo, because in some writings, whenever you see or read some of his writings, you'll see the pseudonym, like the pseudo, because it was believed by some scholars that his writings were somebody else using his name. But that's a complete digression. I apologize for that. But in his writings, he states that the cosmos is engulfed with God's radiance, that the entire cosmos is engulfed with God's radiance and presence. St. Maximus picks this up and continues by saying the logos of created things is related to the Logos, capital L, which is the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And I've talked a little bit about the Logos before in the previous lecture. And a couple definitions for what logos means. This is a Greek term, the plural of which is called logoi. It has many different definitions, one of which is word, reason, meaning, principle, or definition. So that's what this term means. And so St. Maximus writes, the one logos is the many logoi, and the many logoi are the one logos. And so one's inner essence is God's specific intentions for living things to draw it towards himself, towards the divine realm, that God is shaping and guiding creation to himself, because God, in his love towards mankind, created the world to share in, so that all of creation could share in his love. And so according to St. Maximus, the fall, as is depicted, was rather a failure by creation to proceed towards this appointed goal. That it's not necessarily the shattering of a golden age, according to St. Maximus, but it's just this failure for man to realize his true inner essence, his true, to continue on to where God has intended him to be. And continuing on from here, we get the writings from St. Gregory Palamas, who talks about the energy and essence of God. And we mentioned this before, that the essence of God is completely unknowable, but his energy can be experienced and seen even with our own eyes, with the hesychastic monks. And if you go back to the writings of St. Dionysius the Areopagite and take them in the light of St. Gregory Palamas, you can see that the cosmos being engulfed in God's radiance is the cosmos being engulfed in God's energy, because his radiance, his light, as is seen at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, is his energy, is the uncreated light of God that mankind experiences and can experience in the church. And so, according to St. Gregory Palamas, God is the nature of all things, and he transcends every nature. And this is sometimes where you get the concept of panentheism within Orthodoxy, and I want to clarify this term that you sometimes see written and around. Panentheism, as it is defined, is God is in everything, but also that everything is in God. And according to Orthodox Christians, we would know that the essence of God is unknowable. You cannot know God's essence, but we can experience and participate in his energy. And so within the theology as is revealed to us by St. Gregory Palamas, that's how we would use this term. And so likewise, the universe can be seen as moving naturally from its beginning to the eschaton as guided by God. So no matter what definition is given by science for the creation, for material creation, we as Orthodox Christians know that it moves naturally through God's divine providence from its beginning to the end of the world, because eschaton is just a fancy term for the end of the world and the end times and the end of the age. And so let's talk about, what does it mean to be human? There's a lot of different ideas about this. And so this comes together a lot with why we were created. Because knowing about why we were created, we can get a better idea of what it means to truly be human. And so if you want a really good explanation for what a human body is, or what a human person or being is, I urge you to watch a couple episodes of the Lord of Spirits podcast, where they go into a much better definition than I do here, and much more in depth than I am capable of doing here, about what a human body is and what a human person is. And I've linked those in a couple of the handouts that I've given you. The specific episodes are the Mountain of God and the Boat of Theseus for the human person. Likewise, there's a 2-part series in the body on bodies that they have on Ancient Faith Radio that I urge you to listen to get a little bit more idea than what I'm going to go into here. But continuing on to that, there's not really always a one set concept for what a human person is. And so, according to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, man is made in the image and likeness of God. And I'll read that passage for you now. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And so according to this passage, mankind is made in the image and likeness of God. So in this way, mankind is the image of love, because God is love. And so we need to treat each other with love, because everyone is made in the image of God. It doesn't matter if we like the person. It doesn't matter if we necessarily agree with what people say. We have to treat them with love, because they are made in the image of God. And every person has dignity and value and worth because of this. Furthermore, there's a lot of different concepts about what image means. And according to St. John of Damascus, the image can be seen as mankind's free will and reason. But likewise, this image, the term image, could likewise also mean icon, that man is the icon of God. That also, this term image could also be seen as a verb of imaging, that we, through our actions, image God, that we act in a way, when we should act in a way, that image God, so that whenever anybody sees an Orthodox Christian, they can see the light and the love of God through us. I believe St. Seraphim of Sarov wrote that if a person who acquires peace, 1,000 around will be saved. And so this is a good example of this. And so I want to talk also about image, not necessarily being something physical. It's not necessarily that I physically look like God aside from the incarnate logos, because obviously when Christ himself became man, he took on all of humanity. He's fully God and fully man. And so obviously he looked like a man. And we depict this in our icons of Christ. So the image, being in the image and likeness of God, necessitates a life together with God, that we truly become human. We truly become what we as human beings are meant to be, and what we are as humans in relationship with God in the church and being in communion with God. And so we can truly become human after the incarnation, because God himself has become man, and whilst retaining his full divinity, so that we can have communion together with him. And so we need to participate in this life in Christ through the mysteries as have been given to us by the church. And this is according to St. Nicholas Capasilis. If you really want to learn more about how mankind participates in the mysteries of the church, I would read his writing called The Life in Christ. I'll provide a link for it if you wish to. It's a beautiful book. And it's really, he goes through the mysteries of baptism, chrismation, and especially the Eucharist, to talk about our experience and our communion with God in these mysteries. And so the likeness, as is depicted in Genesis, can be attained through struggle and theosis. Theosis is a really important term for us as Orthodox Christians, and it has a couple different definitions that I think are really fitting that I'm going to tell you about. First off, according to Archimandrite Christophoros Stavropoulos, it is the adoption of man, his participation in the incorruptibility of God, and his mixture with the divine nature in indescribable glory and blessedness. So this is what theosis is. This is what we lead to, and this is what the saints work their entire lives to attain. And likewise, according to St. Athanasius the Great, God becomes a man so that he may make Adam into a God, that we can be partakers of God's energy, that we can participate in him. And theosis isn't really just a one and done sort of deal that, oh, I've achieved theosis, I'm there, I've reached the pinnacle. That's not really it. God is infinite and his love is infinite. And there can be so many more levels and heights to attain to, and new levels of love and experience that we can participate in, so that our journey towards theosis starts here on earth, but continues on into the life of the next as we grow together in communion and love with God. So let's talk a little bit about the mystery of the incarnation, as I've mentioned a little bit before. So I want to state that the incarnation of Christ was plan A. This was not just due to mankind falling and messing up so that God had to become man to fix everything. God always intended for the incarnation of Christ to be plan A, that man was always meant to have this special relationship, this special communion with his creator. And so this can be seen by all of creation leading up to this awesome event, as is written in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And so this can be seen that the entire history of mankind, the entire history of the world, the creation, leads up to this awesome and auspicious event, that creation was molded and guided by God so that mankind could be entering into communion with his creator in this special and incredible manner. And so mankind was created for the incarnation so that man could be deified and spend together with an eternity with his creator. And because God the Son, the second person of the Holy Trinity, is a hypostatic union. Basically, his person, as I defined hypostasis before, is the union of man and God. He is the theanthropos, coming from two terms, theos meaning God, anthropos meaning man. He's effectively, if you want to put it in almost a little bit more materialistic terms, which I'm hesitant to do so, he's effectively 200%. He's 100% man and 100% God, 200% effectively. And this is a mystery that has been revealed to us. And so mankind likewise needed the salvation from the wages of sin, which is also another thing that the incarnation accomplishes as a part of the divine economy of Christ, leading to our salvation from our sin and our wickedness that we had committed in our rebellion against God. And so according to St. Athanasius the Great in his writings on the incarnation, he states, by the word made God, death has been destroyed and life raised up anew, that these are some of the effects of the incarnation. And likewise, God has given them, meaning us, a share in his own image, that is, in our Lord Jesus Christ, that they may be able to perceive the image absolute, that is the Word himself, so that we can have communion and enter into this special and wonderful relationship with our Lord and Savior. So let's talk about the difference between man and animals. And so there is a dramatic difference, and this goes beyond biological differences that exist between the two, or any, between man and beasts, or any other species. As can be obviously stated, I'm different than a dog. But this difference is a bit deeper than physical differences. And so there's a difference in the soul of man and the soul of an animal. That mankind has what's known as a rational soul, while animals have what's known as an irrational soul. And so according to St. Basil in his Hexameron, homily 8.2, a difference between the soul of cattle and that of man, the soul of creatures devoid of reason, that they are devoid of reason, that mankind does have, that man has a reasonable soul. He is filled with able to reason and think in this manner. Likewise, according to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it's specifically stated that man became a living soul, as denoting a difference. Likewise, if you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, there's a difference, an ontological difference that exists between man and beast, because man was given dominion over the beasts. He was put above them. He has the crown of creation. As was stated in Genesis chapter 1, 28. And so because of this, there is a denoted difference, a hierarchy, if you will, between man and animals. And so something, as we talked about souls, how exactly are souls created? I really don't know. It's not something that's revealed to us. And I'm not about to try and posit a reason or a method of how, because I don't have one. And there's a certain level of intellectual humility that I must have, because it hasn't been revealed to us, because God has deemed it not necessary for us to know. And so we have to accept and understand that this is a mystery known only to God, according to St. Cyril of Alexandria. There have been a couple heresies about the idea of this, one of which was posited by Origen, where he talks about the pre-existence of souls, that souls apparently were pre-existent that then inhabited a body. This was condemned as a heresy in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and that's not something that we believe. And according to Saints Gregory the Theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, Macarius the Great, Anastasius of Sinai, as well as Maximus the Confessor, all of these great saints of the Orthodox Church state that the body and soul are born and mature together. If you ever need a really good reason as to explain why we believe that life begins at conception, this is an excellent one. And so I would also be greatly remiss if I didn't at least bring up the topic of creation scientists that do exist when talking about the theory of evolution. And so these are primarily Protestants who take a very literal view of Genesis and try to prove this literal interpretation, this theologic point, with the science of today. This has some problems with it, because you are trying to use a fallen world, because the Orthodox Church believes that creation fell with Adam. So you're trying to use a fallen world to prove a prelapsarian existence. And it's a little difficult, to say the least. And as I said before, you can go and watch the previous lecture on where I talk about an Orthodox perspective of the 6 days of creation in Genesis chapter 1 and the creation in Genesis chapter 2, where I somewhat refute the idea that it's meant to be a literalistic interpretation, although it does have its proponents. There is a place known as the Institute for Creation Research, which does try to do this. Father Seraphim Rose of blessed memory highly endorsed this idea. But this idea of a literal interpretation of Genesis, as I tried to explain last time, is not unanimous within the Orthodox Church at all. And so some creation scientists try and use the idea of entropy to prove their point of view, saying that entropy is something known as the disorder in the universe, that it's basically the state of disorder in the universe. And they say that the quark gluon plasma was highly disordered and had a high amount of entropy, like I talked about last time. And then the Big Bang Theory, it had a high amount of entropy. Why wouldn't would matter want to be organized in this specific manner? Well, this is because there's a lot of entropy that still exists. And even though matter is organized in a specific manner, black holes have a great deal of entropy that could result in an increase of entropy. Because according to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy has to be increasing for the entire universe. And so they try and use that. But by and large, many scientific arguments that they make have been refuted by the scientific thought of today. I've actually provided a link to a specific website. It looks a little old and a little outdated, but the citations are really good. If you want to look at some other arguments that exist between creation scientists and other people in the scientific field, with the arguments that they make within science to prove their theological point. I'm not really going to go into all of them here. It's not really my purpose, but they do a very good job there. I don't necessarily support the theological statements made by the website, but it does a really good job of explaining the science, and I think that's really helpful. And so there's also this group known as the people who support intelligent design, which we as Orthodox Christians fall into. But this movement is not necessarily theologically motivated, in the sense that it's not just primarily Protestants. It could be Muslims, Hindus, Orthodox, anybody. And it's basically stating that the creation occurs because it has a primary cause, an originator, and we have a creator. Or rather, as they would say, an intelligent designer. That we as Orthodox Christians would agree with and show that the universe was not created just out of random chance as a cosmic roll of the dice. That it's guided by God, and God has a impact in it, that he's not some distant, far off God that is far removed from humanity. He's here and present with us and fills the earth with his radiance and his light, and that he is guiding creation toward himself. And so many people in intelligent design cite the impossibly low probabilities for evolution to occur, that it would be incredibly unlikely for it to occur. There are some problems with this statement in that there's much debate as to how low or how high the probability of evolution occurring, and whether it's truly random or if there's some selection involved, which there is, according to science, some selection involved with natural selection. I'm not really going to get into in depth in the debate, just to note that this is something that exists, and when engaging with the theory of evolution, one needs to be aware that these ideas do exist. You could also find some of the arguments about probability and statistics in that link that I do provide for you in the handout. And so I want to talk about some things in summary, because we did cover a lot today. The theory of evolution is firmly grounded within today's science. It's not going anywhere, and we need to address it in this way. And it's inherently materialistic. It doesn't really factor in God, as we as Orthodox Christians do. And it's primarily based upon observations made within a fallen world. And so it doesn't really have an idea of our Creator guiding and shaping us, that we as Orthodox Christians categorically believe. And so we know that God created us, and he made us with a purpose. And this was not through random chance. He did use the natural energy and the laws of matter, laws of order that he himself institutes and upholds to guide us and shape us towards him. And it's not through necessarily random chance. And so we can truly fully realize what it means to be human, what it means to be a human person within the incarnation, with the mysteries given to us by the church. And so when evolution is viewed in this manner, we know that God desires to bring himself to us, and that evolution doesn't necessarily have to be opposed to orthodoxy. We already believe and agree with microevolution. The macroevolution, when viewed in this light, could be seen as a way of being theocentric, centered on God, as God guiding us towards himself and guiding us to himself. as opposed to being anthropocentric, centered on man, and that all things are made new in Christ. And so we can view evolution in this manner. So it's not necessarily as opposed to orthodoxy as one might think at the outset. So does anybody have any questions? In the meantime, while I'm waiting for questions, I'm going to go ahead and just flip through my citations. All right. All right. Are there any questions by anybody? Feel free to unmute yourself and just ask away. You can also likewise put a question in the chat if you want. I've got the chat open up if you want to type out your question. I am ready to answer any and all questions you may have. I know that we covered a lot today. Is there anything you want me to clarify or elaborate on that maybe didn't get enough mentioning that you would like to learn a little bit more about or talk about, or something that needs to be explained a bit better? I know biology gets really heavy on terms and definitions, so I tried to explain the best of my abilities. Biology is really big on that, and it's got a lot of definitions and terms, so it can be pretty noun heavy. So if you want me to go back and explain a couple more terms, I can do that if you would like. So just feel free to unmute your mic if you have any questions.
Ian, it's Father Joseph. I think it was an excellent presentation with a lot of good information. And I almost wonder if it was, if it's so thought-provoking that maybe the next class we could almost begin with questions for this class as people have a chance to think about that.
That's certainly fine. Yeah, I'm open to that. It doesn't matter to me at all. I'm here to help. I'm here to serve you. So I am in service to you to help you out, to explain things to the best of my abilities. Or if I don't know the answer, I'll certainly try and look it up, or I can maybe be able to point you to a place to find some information to clarify it. Something I didn't specifically note in the lecture: if you want to read the entirety of St. Gregory of Nyssa's On the Making of Man, I have provided a link for it. A free English translation for it is in the handout of readings and selected readings and passages that I quote and talk about here today. I provide a link, and then that's where I got that translation because I don't speak Greek. So I'm dependent upon English translations. So that may be a little bit of a hindrance. Maybe in the original Greek, some things have a little bit of a different meaning that is lost on me because I'm primarily using English translations because that's all I know. I am not a Greek scholar. There are many actually who are better at Greek than I. So. I know I kind of dumped a whole lot of information on you. I may have went a little fast to try and make sure I got through everything to have a good deal of time for questions if you had any. If you also, I'll just keep gabbing until, feel free to stop me. If anybody wants to chime in with a question, just stop me. Like, you can. But I mentioned in the first lecture the optional book, if you want to learn more about the relationship between science and orthodoxy, that you could purchase if you so chose, the book entitled Science and the Christian Faith, A Guide for the Perplexed by the Reverend Dr. Christopher C. Knight. If you want to talk about if you want to read about the topics from this week and last week, I would read chapters, let me find it, chapters 8 through 11 would be really good in talking about this. He also goes more into the fall than I do, because I don't really talk much about the fall. My focus here is more on creation. So that's definitely something. And last week, well, not last week, sorry, we had a 2-week hiatus as of the time of this recording. Last week, you could see creation on almost a cosmological scale. And this week, we look at creation specifically on mankind, which I hope was insightful.
Thank you, Ian.
All right. Thank you very much.
Looks
I
like
guess
we'll meet next week. Give us a little teaser for next week's class.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to. Give me 1 second. So next week's class, I apologize. Next week's class, let me get past my citations. We'll be talking about the environment and the church, stewards of creation, about how the church, those of us who are the body of Christ in the church, should interact with the environment and what's going on in the environment today. There's definitely a lot of, you see a lot in the news about some bad stuff that's happening, some ecological disasters, oil spills, many other things that, and pollution that occurs in the environment. And so we as Orthodox Christians need to know how to address this. And what do we even see and view these, how these disasters, how does the church relate to global warming and such like that? And is it even our responsibility to do anything about it? That's definitely a question that we're going to talk about in depth. And I'll let you think about, oh, hold up. I see something in the chat. Give me a second. Somebody says that I did not get the Zoom link. Maybe others did not either, as I do not see a lot of names there. Yeah, I know that I sent it to Anne, the church's secretary, and she sent out an email on Monday with it. So there may be an issue with that. Anybody who was not able to watch live through the live Zoom, or maybe because it was too late or what have you, because they had other family obligations with children or what have you. These lectures are recorded and will be put on to the church's YouTube page. So anybody can just watch them at their leisure. If you have questions, you could always email the church, and I know Anne has gotten a question or two to me. I'll put my email address into the chat. I don't particularly want to put it out onto YouTube because I don't want everybody and anybody who ever watches this video to be able to spam my email address, but I will put it in the chat for those who are here to send me any questions if you think about it. Especially for those people who are unable to watch it live. My email address is also in the church directory as well, if anybody happens to have that. So you can get my contact information that way as well. And I do apologize if there was an issue with getting the Zoom link. I know that it was sent out, but it was sent out, I believe, on Monday, as today's Thursday. So it could have easily gotten buried in people's emails. So thank you for your comment. I really appreciate that. Okay. Oh, there's another mention in the chat. Oh, you're very welcome. Somebody was just saying thank you to sending that out. But yeah, we'll be talking about the environment, which is really, really important because planet Earth is our home. And it's a really big deal how we treat our home. And give you a little teaser. According to St. John of Damascus, who was a great defender of icons during the iconoclastic heresy that we talked about in the first lecture, we mentioned in the first one. So if you want a little bit of a refresher, you can go back to watch that. And we even celebrated the triumph of icons on the Sunday of Orthodoxy. And so he states that the whole earth is an icon of the face of God. And so I'll let that be your little bit of a teaser for an idea of how you can think about how we as Orthodox Christians should interact with the environment. So I believe it's almost 8 o'clock now. And if there are no questions, anybody can just jump in if they want to, or send it in the chat. If there's no questions, I think we're going to have to end it here. I appreciate everybody who attended, and everybody who's watching this as a recording. I appreciate that. And I guess I'll see you next time.